But to kickstart the conversation, I had three questions for you to ponder. Number one, how do these ecosystems of research, or between policymakers and researchers, how can that help the pursuit of sustainable growth? Number two, what should these ecosystems look like? So ecosystems is a fun term, but practically, what do we need to be seeing on the ground in terms of the interfacing between policy makers and researchers in India? And third, what can we learn from past experiences in India, but perhaps also elsewhere? Perhaps, Jonathan, you can talk a lot about IGC's co-generation approach here. So I'll have you kick off, Jonathan. Feel free to talk for 5 minutes or so. And then I'll turn to you, Sam, to think about your perspectives from India as well. So, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Quite big questions. Starting with the first one, how can ecosystems help promote sustainable growth? I think to sit back and expect that if academic researchers or any researchers just produce some great ideas and they will find their way into policy and have a great impact is something that we know now is demonstrably untrue. That in order to bring research into policy effectively and to help to create a situation where research is informing real decisions, real policy decisions, quite a bit has to happen. Partly that's because there are some forces that drive the two apart. The timescales of policymaking are typically quite different from the timescales of research. The language of policy is quite different from the language of research, and then the narratives around policy can be very different from the narratives around research. The personalities involved in the two could be very different. So there are lots of things that prevent it from happening naturally. And so I think one of the things that IGC has been sort of reflecting on and evolving its model in response to over the past 15 years is what does it take to make that work? So to start with your first question, what's the payoff to that? The payoff is connecting research more effectively to policy. And I'll talk a bit about that, the different stages of that in a minute, in a way that really generates better outcomes for beneficiaries and generates policy in particular, perhaps that has better long-term effects than might otherwise be the case. So I think the prize is that when we get these sort of interactions and collaborations and even co-generation, as we like to refer to it, to work, then the payoff really is in better policy outcomes and in very, very tangible ways. And one of the things IGC spends a lot of time doing is trying to understand and track our impact. And so we look at those sort of outcomes and so forth quite seriously. So just in terms of how do they help us? I think they really help connect research to policy in a way that just isn't going to happen naturally. And so there's a role for the sort of intentional ecosystem. What do ecosystems look like? Well, let me mush this up a little bit with the last question, which is what can we learn from past experiences? I think for ecosystems to work effectively, lots of people have to be interacting. So crucially, different stakeholders have to be interacting. And researchers are part of that and policymakers are part, but then there are other stakeholders outside of the research and policy sphere. So ecosystems have to be environments in which this interaction works. Well, if we want that to work and it's not working currently, then clearly we have to do something differently. So we have to think, what is it that can change that? And I think what we try to do is think about all the different margins. So what is it that prevents the policymaker from being engaged? What is it that prevents the researcher from being engaged? What is it and to think about both the incentives that these actors are facing and the constraints and so forth. So let me start with some extent the easier part, or maybe the sort of more common part, and that is, what is it that prevents researchers from engaging in issues that the product of which, the research about which can be really useful for policy? Well, one of the things I think is access to data. That data, there can be quite a big fixed cost in terms of starting to do research in an area of a particular area of policy relevance. And so it can just be too daunting to access the research, to clean the data, whatever, or the data might not be available, might be confidential, or it might be this government hasn't got around to making it available. So data is a big thing, and in fact, Katya, who's probably here, has been doing a lot of amazing work in India now to try to build a data lab, working with Niti Aayog and work that we're funding. And the idea there is to really make some of the key data sets, micro data sets, accessible and usable for researchers. So we think that's a key thing, is thinking about the data, and that's can address one of the constraints on researchers. Another is sort of understanding of the context, and depending on what the research is on, that can mean different things: social, political, economic, policy context. In this area that we're talking about, the policy context is particularly important, because impact is not the result of just the quality of the idea or the quality of the evidence, but also the extent to which there's a window of opportunity for change. And the extent to which there's a window of opportunity to change is not easy to determine, because very often there are things which publicly are talked about as reform objectives, which are never, ever going to happen. Right. And so you need to understand where there is the possibility from the policy side of genuine reform. Now, an important part of that tends to be the existence of champions inside government. So individuals who, for various reasons, become people who are both committed to reform and have staked their political identity or whatever on reform, but also committed to using evidence as part of that process. Not the only thing, but as part of the process in trying to promote reform. So identification of reform champions, or at least people who are open to reform, is hugely important in terms of whether research ends up landing, and even understanding what research we should be doing. So that's, I'm now sort of drifting into the sort of constraints and incentives on the policymaker side. So constraints are obviously a lack of information, don't know who might be doing research, who might be relevant, don't even know what kind of research might be relevant to the policy decisions they're trying to make. So what that means is we need to think of mechanisms, and I think in the Indian context, obviously there's lots of existing mechanisms, but we have to think of how we amplify and reinforce them for improving dialogue between policymakers and researchers. So that researchers, and that can be either direct or can be mediated by different kinds of intermediaries. And the idea basically is to bring policymakers into a discussion of the challenges, the policy challenges they face, and where research is both already shedding light on those issues, where it might shed light on those issues, and where it probably can't shed light on those issues, so that we get a better sense both of what we as researchers might want to be doing for them, just distilling existing knowledge, but then in particular also identifying new opportunities for research that will be genuinely useful in helping to unpack and make progress on a policy issue. And I think there's often a tendency to think about research as being most useful in telling policymakers or helping policymakers to understand what works and what doesn't. And there is an important role there, and wrapping evaluation around new policy initiatives, particularly if it's a staggered rollout and that sort of thing, can be very powerful. But research is also very powerful in helping policymakers to think differently about issues, to just reframe how they think, because that often opens up a whole new set of policy instruments that they never thought were relevant. And so I think one of the things we as researchers need to be very mindful of is that it's not just if something connects directly, like A to B, to a particular policy initiative, that it's useful. Even if what it's doing is helping us to get a deeper insight into some part of the context of the policy challenge, then it can be fundamentally influential in changing how people think about it. What do we learn? Okay, briefly, I'm sure I'm over my time, so let me just say very briefly about past experiences. I think a little bit banal maybe, but I think there's certain things that seem to be common across a different range of country, environments, however, and certain things are just different case by case. So first thing to say is every environment is a little bit different, and so new relationships are really important to try to understand what priorities and ways of working and ways of interacting and so forth. So just to give you an example of our current engagements, we have one in Zambia, where the president, who came in August 2021, is very openly committed to reform and very openly wanting to engage with external researchers. And so he's given a very high profile. So we end up having someone embedded in State House, and he's given a very high profile to the research inputs that he wants as part of policy. He's pretty unusual. Right? In most circumstances, you have partnerships at ministerial or DG level that are really what are going to draw things, and that just has to be determined on a country by country basis where the sort of points of entry are and what's going to be most effective and whatever. But I think to summarize some of the common points, I think we need to think about the interaction between researchers and policymakers not being about here's my great findings. So I'll leave it to you to take into practice. It's about a much, much earlier conversation, which is what are the challenges, you face and, that we might be able to be helpful with. And let's have a conversation to see where we might be helpful. From that, flesh out an agenda and some priorities. And then it's always going to be down on us to identify the research questions, right? The policymaker's not going to be able to identify research. So we have to do that and go back and forth. And then once we've identified a policy question that really is going to make a difference, to then involve the policymakers as much as possible as the research proceeds. Because one of the other mistakes we make as researchers tends to be that only the findings are interesting. Actually, the baseline is almost always interesting to the policymaker, and things that come out as intermediate outputs or whatever are interesting. And especially if you're, say, doing an evaluation, the policymaker is much more interested in learning how to do it better than learning that it was wrong ex post, right? Or learning that it was fundamentally flawed ex post. So having design, a sort of research design that's going to facilitate that, and then encouraging the policymakers to do staged rollouts and those sorts of things, which make it easier for them to learn, I think is fundamental to success. And then the final thing I would say is time makes a difference. So the longer you build a relationship over more time, and obviously engaging, honestly and helpfully, then you develop a stronger relationship and all sorts of good stuff happens. They're more open with what the political context really is about. They're more likely to allow you access to data that's confidential. They're more likely to make time for you and other researchers and talk about that stuff. So investing in those relationships, once you identify who is critical, investing in those relationships really pays off in terms of both the effectiveness of the research, but also the sort of the bandwidth, the sort of the breadth of the engagement.